So today is the week 16 and the last lecture of this course, and we will be talking about the environmental policy and the sustainability. The main learning outcomes of this lecture will be that what do we mean by environmental policy and how that policy was formed, what is NEPA and what does it do. We will describe some of the important US environmental laws and some several international environmental laws and conventions. At the end, we will also talk about that how do the different branches of government influence the environmental policy and explain some of the ways that students can contribute to environmental protection. We will also talk about the sustainable development goals. Let's now start with the fossil fuel divestment. What actually the divestment means? So divestment is spreading globally because it has been found that there are around about 800 colleges, the universities, cities, counties, states, and some national governments that represent like $6 trillion in assets have pledged to eliminate their fossil fuel investment. So what's the point of selling these assets? There are many economists that argue that fossil fuel divestment is a futile exercise in political correctness, a pointless and possibly expensive moral crusade. There are certain academic administrators that often reject that this divestment as philosophically they are inappropriate. Some of the economists they argue that endowments are strictly financial and not the policy related. So in short, there are certain policies against this environmental pollution. We have the Environmental Pollution Act, the Clean Water Act, and we will talk about all of them. We have NEPA and EPA. We will talk about them in detail in our coming slides. So assuming that it's impossible to remove that carbon-based fuels from our lives, they argue that it is hypocritical to remove them from investment portfolios. And it would be very foolhardy to sell energy stocks if they are still profitable. Talking about environmental policy, it includes the policies, practices, and laws that are designed to protect human health and well-being. There are certain natural resources and environmental qualities. The safety of our air, drinking water, and food, they're all protected by the laws that are developed by the past generations of owners. And there are certain policymakers also. So it has been found that access to public lands and public waterways, it's also protected by these environmental laws. So most of the time, we forget about these rules and we take these protections for granted. But theoretically, in a democratic system, these policies are actually established through negotiations and compromises. There are certain open debates that allow all voices to be heard, and there are certain policy decisions that promote the collective well-being. So elective representatives, they defend these policies. So what they think is that they will benefit their constituents, but in fact, the rules that result from these political wrangling, they are imperfect. And usually nobody is completely satisfied by these rules, but ideally the rules need to be reasonably palatable to a majority of voters. So the best way to ensure that policies serve the general public interest is to ensure that public is active, it's well informed and involved in the policy making. So for the success of all these policies, we have to ensure that the public is very active in that, it's well informed about the new environmental policies and is also involved in that policy making. So by studying this environmental science, we are taking an important step. It's also important to follow the news, preferably from a variety of sources, to be in touch with those elected representatives. So, what drives this policy making? We all know that power and influence it inevitably that control much of our policy making. So public interests groups group work to gain similar access by developing certain broad support, bringing the citizens to the capital to meet with the legislators, and often it has been found that these groups they organize the public events and protests because they lack the money for influencing the policy. Talking about the demonstrations that can influence the environmental policy makers. So this Moving Planet March was one of the 2000 events. You can see in the picture, the Moving Planet March, which was one of the 2000 events that were organized by 350.org in 75 countries in 2011. So demonstrations like this or actions like this can be effective way to get a message out to influence the decision makers. There are certain public citizenship that's also a powerful force. So many of our current public policies in the United States, for example, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Voting Rights Act, and many other laws that defend the public interests and collective well-being. Citizen movements, they are for environmental quality, often have been important globally and historically. In 2011, China had 70,000 public events. And those events were to protest the pollution, the environmental health issues, and other abuses to the land. So a campaign that was led by artists, the students and writers, it forced actually the government to cancel the plans for a series of 13 large dams on the New River in mountainous southwestern China, which is an area of extraordinary biological and cultural diversity. So there are now more than 2,000 social and environmental organizations in China that for the first time they have officially recognized the status globally. So they support the environmental protection and it's very widespread. So how do these policy issues and options make their way onto the stage of public debate? We often describe the policy development as a cycle you can see here. So we have to identify a problem, set agenda, and then develop certain proposals. And the next step would be to build the support and enact the law or rule that are in place and implement the different policies. And at the end, what we do is that we evaluate the results and suggest the changes that should be made in order to be successful. So we often describe this as a cycle. So a problem is identified, like I said, the plans are, there are some plans to resolve the problem that are developed through the discussions or new rules are proposed. There is some popular support is built together the votes for new rule. But if the rule to agree is agreed to, then it's implemented. So evaluation then leads to identification of flaws in the rule and the cycle starts again. Building support is central to policy development. Often the groups, they hire a lobbyist. A lobbyist is one who can dedicate the weeks, months, or even years to develop the support of legislators. So proponents often do some media campaigns or some public education and personal lobbying of decision makers. So the common strategy actually is to finance these commentators on radio and television who, while in a part position of neutrality, they can promote a particular point of view. So when watching the media, it's always a good idea to follow the money if you want to learn more about the views that have been expressed. The next policy step is the implementation. So the next step in policy cycle is implementation, or we can say the carrying out the new rules. So ideally what we see is that government agencies, they faithfully carry out the policy directives. They provide the services and enforce the rules and regulations. So, continued public attention is needed to make ensure that the government enforces its own rules. We have many of our worst problems in air pollution, water pollution, or related respiratory ailments, for example. They could be controlled if we enforce these existing air quality rules more effectively. So once that rule is enacted or implemented, it almost invariably requires the reevaluation and improvement after the time. So sometimes it has been found that the laws they expire after a designated number of years. So that's necessary to reauthorize a law or vote again to continue that law. So are we better safe than sorry? The precautionary principle, it states that when an activity threatens to harm human health or the environment, we should fully understand the risks that it has before initiating that activity. So people there are four widely accepted tenets of this principle, the precautionary principle. One of them is that people have a duty to take steps to prevent harm. If you suspect something bad might happen, you have an obligation to try to stop it. The next step for this principle uh, to be a success is that burden of proof of cleanliness of a new technology, process, activity, or chemical that lies with the proponents, not with the general public. The third step would be before using a new technology or process or chemical or before starting a new activity, the people have an obligation to examine a full range of alternatives, so including the alternative of not using it. Finally, the fourth step would be for this principle to be a success would be that decisions using the precautionary principle must be open and democratic and must include the affected parties. There is the European Union that has adopted this precautionary principle as the basis of its environmental policy. In the US also, the opponents of this approach, they claim actually that it threatens the productivity and innovation. There are certain major environmental laws. So we depend on countless laws to protect the water that we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, or the biodiversity that surrounds us. So most of these laws, they actually work to negotiate a balance between the differing interests and needs of various groups or between the private interests and the public interest. Let's now talk about the different acts, the environmental policy acts, one by one. First, we will talk about the NEPA, which was established in 1969. So, NEPA actually means the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the cornerstone of US environmental policy. What actually NEPA does? It does three important things. One is that it authorizes the Council on Environmental Quality that oversight the board for general environmental conditions. The second thing that it does is that it directs the federal agencies to take the environmental consequences into account for decision making. It also requires an environmental impact system to be published for every major federal project, like to have an important impact on environmental quality. So, in short, we can say that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, it does not forbid environmentally destructive activities if they otherwise comply with relevant laws, but it requires that the agencies admit publicly that what they plan to do. So every major federal project in the US, it requires an EIS. What kinds of projects require an EIS? The activity must be federal and it must be a major activity with a significant environmental impact, like you can see here in this figure. So whether these specific activities they meet these characteristics is often a subjective decision. So there is each case is very unique, and It depends upon the geography, the balance of beneficial versus the harmful effects, and whether any areas of special cultural, scientific, or historical importance might be affected. So, a complete EIS for a project is actually the time consuming and costly. So, the final document that is often hundreds of pages long and generally takes like 6 to 9 months to prepare. So that was all about the NEPA. Now let's talk about the Clean Water Act. The US Clean Air Act regulates the air emissions. So Clean Air Act provided the first nationally standardized rules in the United States to identify, monitor, and reduce the contaminants. The core of the act is an identification and regulation of seven major criteria of pollutants that are also known as the conventional pollutants. And these seven major pollutants are sulfur oxides, lead, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, the particulates, the volatile organic compounds, and the metals and halogens such as mercury and bromine compounds. So it's provided the first nationally standardized rules to identify, monitor, and reduce all of these seven uh, air contaminants. One more is the Clean Water Act that was established in 1972. Water protection has been a goal with wide public support in part because clean water is both healthy and an aesthetic amenity. So the act aimed to make the nation water fishable and swimmable that's healthy enough to support the propagation of fish. We have the shellfish that could be consumed by humans and low in contaminants so that they are safe for swimming and recreation. So the first goal of Clean Water Act, that's the CWA, was to identify and control the point source pollutants. So end of the pipe discharge from factories, for example, we have the municipal sewage treatment plants, we have certain and other sources. So discharges, they are not actually eliminated, but water at pipe outfalls must be tested and permits are issued that allow the moderate discharge of low risk contaminants. For example, we have certain nutrients or salts or some metals, solvents, or oil high counts of these fecal bacteria and other more serious contaminants. They must be captured before the water is discharged from a plant. One more act that we will be talking about is the Endangered Species Act that protects the wildlife. So, this 1973 Act identifies and lists the species that are very vulnerable or threatened, or we can say endangered. So, once a species is listed as endangered, this act provides the rules for protecting it and its habitat. So ideally, you can see that in order to help make recovery possible. So this Endangered Species Act, it maintains a worldwide list of endangered species. In 2010, the list included like 1,969 threatened and endangered species, and out of them, 753 were plants, because we all know that the plants are also at the verge of extinction. So, the responsibility for studying and attempting to restore these threatened and endangered species, it lies mainly with the Fish and the Wildlife Service and also the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. One more act is the Superfund Act that was established in 1980. So, until recently, the fund was supplied mainly. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, I was just thinking because I was signed out for a while, so that's why I just. So this Superfund Act, that's the 19 that was established in 1980. It was supplied mainly by contribution from industrial producers of those hazardous wastes. In 1995, however, Congress that voted to end that source and Superfund was allowed to dwindle to negligible levels. So since then, the cleanup has been paid for by public taxpayers. So according to EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency, 1 in 4 Americans lives within 3 miles of a hazardous waste site. So this Superfund program, it has identified that more than 47,000 sites that may require the cleanup. So most serious of these, that are the most serious for which proponents have been sufficiently vigorous, they have been put on a national priority list. And it has been found that about 1,600 sites have been put on this list and over 1,000 cleanups have been completed. So the total cost of remediation is expected to be somewhere between $370 billion and $1.7 trillion. The act, the proper name of this law is informative, though it's the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. That's the CERCLA. The act is comprehensive, addressing the orphan sites or emergency spills or uncontrolled contamination, and it allows the Environmental Protection Agency to establish the liability so that the polluters they help pay for the cleanup. So how all these policies they are implemented? The laws, the policies that we discussed earlier, that's the NEPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, or ESA, that means the Endangered Species Act. These are policies, or how these policies are implemented. So each of these laws resulted from an action at local, state, and national levels by the citizens and elected representatives who negotiate these policies. So these environmental laws that can be established or modified in each of the three branches of government. One is the legislative, another is judicial, and the third one is executive. So legislative branch established the laws, that's the federal laws. They are enacted by Congress and signed by the president. So citizens can be involved in this process either by writing or calling their elected representatives or by appearing at the public hearings. So all the bills and all public laws, they are actually passed by the Congress that are available for you to examine as part of this public record. So if you want some more details about that, you can go on the website like www.thomas.gov. So citizens can be involved in legislative process by writing or calling their elected representatives. One mode is the organizing protests that can help attention to your issue. For example, global awareness of environmental issues can push the countries to comply with the treaties. So here you can see a youth group from the Maldives, an island nation which is threatened by rising sea levels, stages a protest as part of the global 350.org movement for controlling the climate change. The second resolution is the judicial branch that resolves the legal disputes. So judicial branch, if we talk about that of government, it decides that what the precise meaning of a law is, or whether or not the law have been broken or the law violates the constitution. So when a law may have been broken, it becomes a matter of criminal law or civil law. So US Supreme Court, it decides whether a law is consistent with the Constitution of the United States. Let's now talk about the executive branch that directs the administrative laws. So more than the executive branch, it directs actually the administrative law. More than 100 federal agencies and thousands of state and local boards and commissions They oversee the environmental rules. So these bodies, they set the rules, they decide the disputes and investigate the misconduct. They also make certain executive rules that have been implemented. They can have far reaching environmental consequences. So, when we talk about the executive rules, they can be done quickly and with little interference from Congress. The executive branch, it also includes certain agencies. For example, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which oversee and enforce the public laws. The EPA is the primary agency with responsibility for protecting the environmental quality in the United States. This Protection Agency was created in 1970 at the same time as NEPA that we already talked about. The EPA has more than 18,000 employees and 10 regional offices. So other agencies that have environmental impacts or the Department of Interior, which oversees the public lands. We have they also oversees the national parks and the Department of Agriculture, which oversees certain forests and some grasslands. There is often a strategy to change this public policy with little public oversight or some discussions. For example, President Clinton's administration, it established the rules that protect 58 million acres of roadless wilderness areas from logging and developing. So President Bush, it quickly reversed those rules after his election. So opening those roadless acres to the development. The Obama administration then overturned the Bush rules, returning protections to roadless wilderness areas. We already talked about the smoky bear that symbolizes the Forestry Service role in extinguishing the wildfires. So, how much government do we want? In this in 1981, the inaugural address by President Ronald Reagan famously said, "The government is not the solution to our problem, so government is the problem." In this, he invoked a perennial debate in American politics. So, is government a power that undermines the personal liberties, or is government a defender of liberties and rights in a world where the bullies they too easily have their way? So, do governments defend their own interests, or they have a mechanism for defending the public interest and the common good? If we talk about the answers, they sometimes depend on when you ask. So debates about the proper size and role of government are always present. So part of the reason why these disputes arise is persist maybe that both views are partially correct. So here in this picture, you can see the tornadoes, floods, or hurricanes, or other natural disasters. They afflict us. We expect government agencies to help us. Certain international policies, with growing recognition of interconnections in our global environment, the nation have become increasingly interested in signing on to international agreements, or we can say the treaties or conventions for environmental protection. So, a principal motivation in these treaties is the recognition that the countries can no longer act alone to protect their own resources and interests. Water resources, the atmosphere, and trade in endangered species and many other concerns, they cross these international boundaries. So, a principal motivation in these treaties is the recognition that countries can no longer act alone to protect their own resources. Here are some major international agreements or the benchmark agreements. We have one, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. We have the Montreal Protocol that protects the stratospheric ozone, the Basel Convention that was signed in 1992. It restricts the shipment of hazardous waste. We have some UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was established in 1994. The main aim of that convention was to direct the governments to share data on the climate change or to develop certain national plans for controlling the greenhouse gases and to cooperate in adapting to climate change. So, talking about the enforcement, it depends on the national pride. So, enforcement of international agreements, it usually depends on the idea that the countries care about their international reputation. So, except we have some most countries that are reluctant to appear irresponsible, or we can say immoral in the eyes of international community. So, shining a spotlight on those conventions will often push a country to comply more with international agreements. So, except in the extreme cases, for example, the genocide, the global community is unwilling to send an external policy force into the country because states are wary of interfering with the internal sovereignty of other states. Here you can see in this picture that the President Barack Obama, he meets with the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabo at United Nations Climate Change Conference in Denmark in 2009. Japan helped the derail attempts to list the bluefin tuna that was endangered under the CITES. So in 2010, Japan almost single-handedly derailed the site's protection for bluefin tuna, despite the fact that these beautiful, highly evolved, long-lived top predators, they are now at less than 15% of historic levels. They may already be headed for extinction. So, part of Japan's objections to fishing limits is that they don't like to be told that they can or cannot eat. So, economics, it also plays a major role. In 2012, there was a single 593-pound bluefin tuna that was caught off northeastern Japan that fetched a record 736,000 or about 1,238 per pound at the first auction of the year at Tokyo's Suki market. So, what actually the students can do? What you can do is that whatever skills and interests you can participate in policy formation and help to contribute to understanding and protecting our common environment. So, we can communicate the ideas of environmental science that requires the educators, the policymakers, artists, writers, engineers, economists, and business leaders. Environmental educators, they also need to help to train an environmentally literate population. The National Environmental Education Act, passed by Congress in 1990, it identified the environmental education as a national priority. The Act established the two broad goals. One was to improve the public understanding of environment, and the other was to encourage the post-secondary students to pursue the careers that are related to the environment. Environmental education, it also helps to develop awareness and appreciation of ecological systems or the ecological services and uh, how those services they work together. Citizen science, it lets everyone to participate. So internships in agencies and environmental organizations is one way to get involved. So another way of doing this is to get involved in organized citizen science projects in which ordinary people, they join with the established scientists to answer the real scientific questions. So similar opportunities, they exist in many places. The Audubon Christmas bird count is a good example. So Earthwatch, they offers a much smaller but more intense opportunity to take part in research. So every year hundreds of Earthwatch projects, each field a team of a dozen or so volunteers who spend a week or two working on certain environmental issues, ranging from the loon nesting behavior to archaeological digs. The American River Watch organizes the team of students to measure the water quality. So you might be able to get the academic credit as well as a helpful practical experience in one of these projects. So community-based research, it was also pioneered in the Netherlands. So similar research opportunities, they exist in the United States and Canada too. So, Christmas bird count is probably the most widespread and longest lasting citizen science project in the world. Every Christmas since 1900, groups of volunteers they have gone out to count the birds in designated areas for the 112th count over 2,200 teams. So, more than 60,000 participants counted over 61 million birds belonging to 2,309 species. So most counts are in the United States or Canada, but teams from the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and Central and South America, they also participate. So participants enter their bird counts on standardized online forms and compile the data and can be viewed and investigated online. So almost as soon as they are submitted. So technology has made the consumer goods and services cheap and readily available in the richer countries of the world. A century ago, there were certain economists and social critics, that's the Thorsten Veblen. He wrote the theory of ledger class, in which he coined the term conspicuous consumption. So, what actually he meant is that conspicuous consumption is a term that is used to describe the things that we buy just to impress the others. So, things we don't really want or we don't really need. So, he used the term to describe those things. So, Veblen's ideas are more relevant today than ever. Some social critics call this accelerated uh, consumerism as affluenza. There are certain student organizations if you are interested in a career in environmental policy, law, science, journalism, or other related fields, or you want to get involved in student groups. This is a very good way to build the knowledge and experience. So many of today's environmental and political leaders, they have gained experience in policy, leadership, and organizing by working with the student groups. So these activities can be as informative and life changing as the courses you take. So because they give you the experience of being in charge and making those decisions. There are certain colleges and universities that often serve as incubators for new ideas. The students and faculty, they have the knowledge, energy, enthusiasm, and opportunity to do certain basic research and innovation. But the school administrators, they are also motivated to promote more sustainable strategies. So especially when those strategies, they involve energy savings and that cut costs in the long term. So green building is one of the areas in which colleges and universities often show the leadership. More than 110 colleges have buildings that are certified to leadership in energy and environmental design. So there are certain prize-winning sustainable designs that can be found at large institutions. For example, we have the Stanford University and same colleges, for example, Oberlin College in Ohio or Middlebury in Vermont. So these are some of the prize-winning sustainable designs or the green buildings. Here you can see a picture of Oberlin College with a green building, which is designed by architect Bill McDonough, that features 370 meters square of photovoltaic panels on its roof. It has a geothermal well that can help heat and cool the building. The large south-facing windows that are also used for passive solar crane and a living machine for water treatment, including certain plant-filled tanks in an outdoor solarium, and a constructed wetland is also there outside this building. There are certain audits that can help to reduce the energy consumption. Audits are very useful because in all of the environmental science, we need some meaningful data to evaluate how a system is working. So audits actually show where a campus is performing well and where to focus the effort. So one of the leading campus audit program is run by the Association for Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, that is the AASHE. So institutions that do an ASHE based audit, they can compare their performance to that of some 870 other educational institutions, and they can plot the progress over time. So there has been a recent study by Sustainable Endowments that institute evaluated more than 100 of the leading colleges and universities in the United States. The report card that ranked the Dartmouth, Harvard, Stanford, and Williams as the top of the A list of 23 greenest campuses. So Berea College in Kentucky, they got the special attention as a small school with a strong commitment to sustainability. So, what actually is the challenge of sustainable development? If we talk about the idea of sustainability, we hope to be here for the long term. So, we can't deplete the natural systems we depend on for food, water, energy, fiber, waste disposal, and other life support services. So, the idea of sustainable development is actually to share the opportunity by improving the people's lives in impoverished regions and to extend the human well being in many generations. So, to be truly enduring, these benefits must be available to all humans and not just to the members of a privileged group. One more commission was the World Commission on Environmental and Development that defined this sustainable development in our common future as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Here is a model for integrating sustainable development. So, what actually this model says is that economic growth usually implies an increase in average welfare or well being. So, sustainable development implies that growth can be based on non consumptive activities, for example, education or arts, as well as on carefully managed renewable resources, for example, soils, forests, and fisheries. Here are some goals of sustainable development and energy transition to high efficiency in production and use. It should be coupled with increasing reliance, demographic transition to a stable world population of low birth and death rates. There should be a resource transition that to reliance on nature's income without depleting its capital, an economic transition to sustainable development, and a broader sharing of its benefits. So, what actually should the sustainable development do? It must protect the needs of the future generations. The primary aim of Millennium Development Goals are to measure improve health, education, and welfare by 2015. So, its specific concerns that are ending is the hunger and poverty, improving access to education, equity for women, improving the infant and maternal health, combating the major diseases, and supporting the environmental quality. So together we can say that all these goals, they seek to improve the opportunities for future generations around the world. So here is an overview of certain sustainable development goals that must protect the needs of future generations. Concluding today's chapter, we have examined some of the basic environmental policies and the ways these policies were formed. There are many players in the formation of environmental policy. So, in short, we can say that it's a teamwork. So, student activism has been established, and it's essential for both shaping the policy and for building the leadership skills and experience. And then we talked about the sustainable development, which is one of our greatest challenges, and finding the ways to share those opportunities without destroying the resources. It requires a creativity and commitment. That was all about today's lecture. Thanks for your attention.